Why would a retired war dog attack a grieving stranger at a soldier's funeral? Because beneath the rain, the black coat, and the fake sorrow, he recognized the same scent from the ambush that killed his handler years ago. Why did the retired German shepherd at a soldier's funeral suddenly stop mourning and start hunting someone in the crowd? At first, no one noticed the change, because grief has a way of making every silence look the same, and on that gray morning the cemetery was full of silence. The wind moved slowly across the rows of stones, carrying the smell of wet earth, trimmed grass, and the faint metal scent that rises from cold air before rain. Black uniforms stood in disciplined stillness around the open grave. A folded flag rested on the coffin, like the final sentence of a life spent in service. The bugle had not yet sounded, the honor detail had not yet stepped forward, and the old dog lying beside the casket looked exactly as everyone expected him to look, head low, muzzle silvered by age. Shoulders heavy with the weight of a bond death had no right to touch. But the veteran standing nearest to him saw it before anyone else did. He saw the ears lift. He saw the nose test the air. He saw the old instincts rise through grief, like something buried refusing to stay buried. If stories of loyalty, buried truth, and the kind of bond that keeps fighting long after the war is supposed to be over means something to you, then this journey on Shepherd Soldier Stories is for you, because the funeral that day was not only for the dead. It was also the place where the past came back to identify the man who should never have been allowed to stand among the grieving. The cemetery sat on the edge of town, where the land opened into low fields and bare winter trees, and the weather made everything feel older than it was. Clouds hung low and colorless above the headstones. Damp soil darkened the fresh grave until it looked almost black. The men and women gathered there kept their composure the way soldiers always do in public, shoulders square, faces fixed, voices low. But grief showed itself in smaller ways, in clenched jaws, in gloved fingers tightening around caps, in eyes that never stayed long on the coffin, because staying too long would make the loss real in a way training could not contain. The dead veteran had been the sort of man others leaned on without saying so. He had survived enough to become quiet, and then become trusted. The kind of soldier younger men followed, because he never wasted words, and never let fear travel farther than it had to. The kind who came home carrying damage in places no medic could dress, then spent years trying to build a civilian life around the cracks. He had been buried in uniform because his family said it was how he had understood himself best, though the truth was crueler than that. He had never fully come back from the ambush that took most of his team. The old German shepherd beside the coffin had not come back from it either. The dog had once been all muscle, speed, and flawless command response, a working animal whose body moved like sharpened instinct made visible. Now age had marked him in unmistakable ways. There was gray spreading across his muzzle and above his eyes, stiffness in the first step after lying down, and an old scar beneath the coat on one shoulder that pulled slightly when he turned too fast. But anyone who looked carefully could still see what he had been. The chest was still broad. The neck still carried that disciplined military bearing. The eyes, deep brown and almost painfully intelligent, still watched the world with the focus of a creature that had spent its best years between danger and the men it was trained to protect. During the months leading up to the funeral, after the death of the handler, who had been his whole world, the dog had barely eaten for anyone else. He had accepted care, accepted water, accepted the routines of survival, but not life. He slept near the dead man's boots. He waited outside the bedroom door that would never open again. He ignored every soft voice that told him it was over. That morning, when they brought him to the cemetery and laid him beside the coffin for the final goodbye, most people thought they were witnessing the last act of pure loyalty. They were wrong. They were watching the beginning of recognition. The veteran at the graveside was one of the last surviving men from the same unit, though surviving was a word that never sat comfortably on him anymore. He was older now, broader through the shoulders, slower in motion than he had once been, but there was still something tightly controlled in the way he stood, as if even grief had to get through old discipline before it reached his face. He had known the dead man before either of them learned how fragile life could become in a single burst of fire and dirt. He had also known the dog since the first week the animal was assigned to the unit, back when the shepherd was young enough to lunge at shadows, and proud enough to resent every command that asked him to wait instead of strike. Over time, dog and handler had become almost impossible to separate in memory. Where one was, the other wasn't far behind. Patrols, convoys, base perimeters, long nights, dust storms, heat, rain. The dog had learned the dead man's moods, and the dead man had learned the difference between each bark, each shift of posture, each silence that meant the animal had detected something human senses had missed. That kind of bond never looks dramatic when it is real. It looks ordinary, functional, quiet, right up until the moment it becomes the only reason anyone walks away alive. The veteran nearest the coffin remembered all of that, and because he remembered it, the change in the dog's body terrified him almost immediately. At first, it was nothing more than a slow lift of the head. Then the nostrils widened. Then the eyes, dull with mourning only seconds before, sharpened with a hard clarity that did not belong in a funeral setting. The dog did not look at the grave. He did not look at the folded flag. He looked past all of it, through the line of mourners, toward the rear left edge of the gathering where civilians and extended families stood in dark coats under bare trees. The veteran followed that line of sight on instinct, but saw nothing unusual. A widow in black gloves gripping a handkerchief too tightly. Two grown sons holding themselves together by force. Neighbors. Retired servicemen. A local chaplain. A man half hidden by an umbrella, face lowered, posture unremarkable. Nothing there should have mattered. And yet the dog's body continued to change in a way grief could not explain. His spine straightened. The fatigue left him. One front paw shifted under him with quiet precision. This was not sorrow anymore. This was target acquisition. The veteran felt something cold move down through his chest because he had seen that transformation before, years ago, on roads where one mistake meant pieces of men scattered across burning metal. The dog only became this still when certainty had replaced doubt. The chaplain began speaking then, voice low and measured, but the veteran barely heard the words. Memory had started moving inside him faster than thought. Dust rising in a village alley. The sound of children somewhere distant. A call over the radio cut short in static. The dead man crouched beside a shattered wall with the shepherd at heel, both of them listening to something hidden just beyond ordinary hearing. The ambush had happened in the final year of deployment, near the end of what was supposed to be a routine sweep through a district already declared stable by men who were never first through the door. Officially, the report said the explosive had been command detonated from concealment after a supply handoff was compromised. Officially, the team was struck by enemy action following a leak of route information through unknown channels. Officially, no infiltrator was ever identified. Those words had sat in files for years, like dry bones, neat and useless. But the men who lived through that day carried different memories. They remembered the dead man insisting something about the setup felt wrong. They remembered the dog refusing to calm near a local intermediary everyone else had already waved through. They remembered a metallic scent, faint and strange, clinging to cloth and skin in a way the dog could not stop reacting to. Not gun oil. Not fuel. Something else. Something sharp, industrial, almost sterile beneath the human sweat. That memory had never left the handler, and it had not left the dog either. Standing at the grave now, the veteran realized the old shepherd was sensing that same thing again. A few people near the rear shifted uneasily as the dog rose to his feet. That alone pulled a little attention away from the service, because everyone there knew the animal had barely moved since arriving. The movement was slow at first, almost respectful, as though he were only trying to change position beside the coffin. Then he turned, and the entire mood of the ceremony changed without anyone yet understanding why. His ears were fully up. His weight had moved forward. His tail was low and rigid. Not fear. Not agitation. Commitment. The veteran took one step sideways to intercept him if needed, but the dog did not break into confusion or random aggression. He fixed on one point in the crowd and began walking toward it with a directness that made several uniformed men glance sharply at each other. Someone whispered the dog's name. Someone else reached instinctively for the leash draped loose from his collar. Too late. The old shepherd crossed the wet grass with a speed that did not seem possible in a body that had looked half-broken only moments earlier, threading through black coats and polished shoes, never taking his eyes off the same mourner near the back. The man under the umbrella looked up just as the dog reached him, and in that fraction of a second the veteran saw three things at once. The mourner's face drain of color, the dog's lips peeled back in a soundless snarl, and the umbrella hand jerked not in fear, but toward the inside of his coat. The impact hit hard enough to slam the man backward against a headstone. Women screamed. Two soldiers moved at once. The umbrella flew from the man's hand and rolled across the grass. The German shepherd did not bite immediately. He pinned, front paws crushing the man's chest, jaws hovering at the throat, barking now in explosive bursts that carried more warning than fury. The mourner tried to twist away, and the dog drove him harder into stone, one paw raking down black formal fabric to expose the hand that had gone inside the coat. The veteran was already running before anyone else understood this was not a random break in training. He reached them just as the pinned man hissed something under his breath that no grieving stranger should ever have said at a funeral. It was not the words themselves that froze him. It was the accent, the cadence. A voice dragged half out of another place and another year. Around them, the cemetery had dissolved into chaos, people shouting, boots pounding, the honor guard breaking formation, family members pulling each other back from danger. But inside the veteran's head the world narrowed to the old dog, the man under him, and the smell rising suddenly into the cold air after the umbrella fell and the coat opened. Metal. Sterile. Sharp. The exact scent the dead handler had once warned them never to forget. And when the pinned mourner lifted his eyes and looked straight into the veteran's face, there was no grief in them at all. There was only recognition, and fear that the wrong witness had survived long enough for the dog to remember. For one breathless moment, no one at the graveside understood what they were looking at. To the family, it looked like a dog losing control in the middle of mourning. To the honor guard, it looked like a security breach with no visible weapon yet drawn. To the older veterans present, it looked worse than both, because they had seen enough of war to know the difference between confusion and certainty, and there was nothing confused about the way the German shepherd held that man to the stone. He had not attacked wildly. He had not snapped at random movement or reacted to raised voices. He had crossed the wet grass like a line pulled tight to one destination, and now he kept the mortar pinned with the unbearable precision of an animal acting on old knowledge instead of present panic. The bark that tore from his chest again made the nearest civilians recoil in terror, but the veteran rushing toward them heard something else in it. Warning. Confirmation. Urgency. The dog was not saying danger might be here. He was saying danger had already been found. The veteran reached them just as two uniformed men lunged in from opposite sides, both trying to control the scene before the funeral dissolved completely. One grabbed for the shepherd's collar. The other went low to drag the pinned mourner clear. "Don't touch him!" The veteran shouted so sharply that both men hesitated in instinctive response, and that hesitation may have been the only reason the man on the ground failed to finish what he had started. Because the veteran saw it then, not clearly enough for the crowd, but clearly enough for someone trained to read threat inside movement. The mourner's hand, half hidden by the folds of his black coat, had not been reaching for balance. It had been reaching inward with deliberate purpose, fingers searching along the inside seam for something strapped close to the ribs. The veteran dropped hard to one knee and seized the man's wrist before the hand could disappear deeper. The body under the dog was wiry, stronger than it looked, and it reacted instantly, twisting with controlled violence instead of frightened self-defense. That was the second thing wrong with him. Grieving men do not move like trained operatives when 70 pounds of military dog are pressing the breath out of them. "Get his other hand?" the veteran snapped, and one of the uniformed men obeyed automatically, grabbing the mourner's free arm as the shepherd's teeth flashed closer to the throat without making contact. The dog was holding himself at the edge of a bite, every muscle in his aging body trembling from the effort of restraint, and the veteran understood the enormity of that in a flash. The shepherd could have gone for the kill. Any animal this certain, with this history, with this scent in his nose, would have been justified in his own instincts to finish it. But he had pinned instead of torn. He had left room for the humans to see what he had found. That meant somewhere inside all that war-trained urgency and old trauma, the dog was still working as he had once worked beside his handler. Detect, control, allow the team to confirm. The mourner hissed through clenched teeth, trying to wrench free, and the veteran felt the inside of the coat at last. Not a firearm. Too small. A narrow metal cylinder, cool against the fingertips even through fabric, clipped into a hidden holster sewn into mourning clothes that were a little too neat, a little too new, a little too deliberately ordinary. He tore it loose and stared at it for half a second in disbelief. It looked almost harmless. Sleek. Matte dark. Pen-sized. But he knew better. Field trigger. Custom detonation device. The sort of thing built to avoid metal scans by looking forgettable until the exact second it mattered. The cemetery soundscape changed instantly once the object came into view. Gasps. A woman crying out. Orders shouted with real fear now, not mere funeral disruption. The honor detail moved fast, training taking over where grief had frozen everyone else, and within seconds the nearest mourners were being pulled back from the grave in a widening ring of confusion. The chaplain was escorted away. Family members were moved behind vehicles and stone markers. One soldier drew a sidearm and covered the pinned man, while another barked for emergency services and bomb response, even though no visible device had yet been found. The veteran barely heard any of it. His whole attention remained fixed on the man beneath the shepherd and the scent rising from his open coat. It was there now, unmistakable in the damp cold air. Metallic, sharp, faintly chemical, the same sterile edge that had clung to a supply intermediary's sleeves on the last day the dead handler's team had been whole. For years, the smell had lived in memory without a name. Men who survived that deployment remembered it only in fragments. A trace on cloth. A residue on vehicle canvas. A note the dog would not stop reacting to no matter how many times command insisted the scene had already been cleared. Now that same scent was here, at a grave, on a mourner who should never have drawn the dog's attention if grief were all he had brought with him. The pinned man stopped struggling as soon as he realized the device had been found. That stillness was somehow colder than violence. Rain began at last, light at first, a scatter of gray drops on polished black shoes and folded flags and wet grass. The German shepherd did not move. Water darkened his coat. The veteran could see the dog's age in the shaking muscles of his forelegs, the effort of keeping pressure on the man, while his whole body battled the pull of instinct and exhaustion. Yet the eyes remained fixed and terrible. Brown, yes, but so focused they seemed to harden into something metallic themselves. The mourner tilted his head just enough to look at the veteran, and for the first time his face settled into something like expression. Not panic. Not pleading. Contempt, thinly hidden beneath calculation. "Still takes orders from ghosts," he muttered, and hearing those words in that voice was like being dropped through years into burning sunlight and screaming radios. The veteran's hand tightened on the man's wrist without meaning to. The accent was real now that the false softness had fallen away. Not broad enough for easy identification, but regional, familiar in the worst possible way, threaded with an old war zone the veteran had spent years trying to shut out of his dreams. One of the younger soldiers nearby asked what the device was, but the veteran did not answer immediately because a more urgent thought had cut through him. If this man had brought a trigger, where was the charge? Every nerve in his body went tight at once. He looked toward the grave, the vehicles, the assembled stone markers, the floral stands, the honor detail's ceremonial firing setup, the black sedan parked half-hidden under bare trees. Anywhere. It could be anywhere. A funeral offered perfect cover. Crowds, emotion, ritual, fixed attention, predictable positions, military presence, surviving witnesses gathered in one place. The dead handler's family. Former team members. Retired personnel. If someone had wanted to finish old work, this was not merely symbolic. It was efficient. He rose halfway from the penman and shouted for the perimeter to be cleared wider, for no one to touch any floral stands or vehicles, for bomb response to treat the entire cemetery as live. Several people stared at him like he was overreacting until the man under the shepherd smiled. It was small, barely there, but it confirmed everything. No grieving stranger smiles when suspected of carrying a detonator at a veteran's funeral, unless the funeral was never the reason he came. The old shepherd gave another bark then, but shorter now, and shifted his weight without releasing pressure. The veteran knew that movement too. The dog had more to indicate. He followed the line of the shepherd's nose and saw it settle not on the penman's chest or hands, but on the right sleeve near the cuff. Wet rain had darkened the cloth enough to reveal a faint, irregular stain around the seam. Chemical transfer. The veteran grabbed the arm and rolled the cuff back. There, hidden beneath the formal black fabric, was a narrow strip of old scar tissue winding around the wrist in a pattern no funeral attendee would notice and no ordinary criminal would carry with pride. It looked like a healed restraint burn or field injury long gone wrong. But to the veteran, it triggered another memory from the old case file photos and after-action witness fragments. One of the suspected facilitators who vanished before the ambush investigation collapsed had reportedly worn a wire bracelet soaked in reactive compounds during device assembly, leaving a distinctive chemical burn. No identification ever came of it because no body was recovered and no interrogation survived beyond rumors. Yet the handler, who was now in the ground, had once described seeing that same banded mark when a local intermediary passed a satchel from one vehicle to another during a friendly transfer gone bad. The dog, then young and furious, had nearly broken command to go after him. The handler had written it down. The note had vanished into the official report and then into nothing. Until now. That memory struck the veteran so hard he had to steady himself against the headstone for a second. Rain intensified, turning coat slick and grass dark. Around the outer ring of the cemetery, engines started as security repositioned vehicles and moved the family farther back. Someone had draped a tarp over the coffin. The folded flag on top remained visible under the wet plastic like an eye that refused to close. The veteran looked at it only once, and grief hit him sideways, because the man inside the coffin should have been the one standing here now, reading the dog's signals, finishing what had never been finished. The dead handler had spent years, after retirement, trying to pull the old investigation back open. Quietly at first. Then with more pressure. Freedom of information requests. Calls to people who still owed him favors. Questions asked at the wrong levels. He never spoke much about it in public, but those closest to him knew he believed the ambush had not only been facilitated from the outside. Someone had protected the facilitator after. Someone had helped the trail vanish. Then, months ago, the handler stopped asking questions. Publicly he had made peace. Privately, he began receiving unsigned notes and late-night calls that ended in silence. And now he was in the ground. Official cause of death: heart failure. Natural. Quiet. Unremarkable. Yet the veteran had never fully believed in the neatness of it. Not because he wanted conspiracy, but because soldiers learn to distrust timing when timing is too convenient. The mourner laughed once under his breath, the sound swallowed almost immediately by rain, and shouted orders. "He never let it go," he said, eyes fixed on the veteran. "That was his problem." Those words nearly broke the last of the veteran's restraint. He hauled the man's head sideways against the wet stone and demanded where the device was, but the answer that came back was worse than refusal. "You're standing in it." For one terrible half-second, the cemetery itself seemed to shift. The grave, the coffin, the honor detail rifles, the mourners, the wreath stands. All of it suddenly felt unstable, potentially rigged, every object a threat. The bomb team was still minutes out. The family was not yet far enough away. The man under the dog had intended not merely to attend the funeral, but to turn it into completion. One final burial of witnesses, grief used as camouflage, military ritual used as timing. The veteran shouted again for total evacuation, for no one to approach the grave, for everyone to move behind the outer access road. Panic started then in earnest, the restrained kind that happens when trained people know fear is no longer hypothetical. Boots pounded through wet grass. Voices rose. The chapel car reversed too fast and nearly clipped a stone. A woman collapsed and had to be carried. Through all of it, the German shepherd still did not leave the man's chest. Then the dog did something even stranger. He stopped barking altogether and lowered his muzzle to the mourner's throat, inhaling slowly, intensely, not as a predator but as a witness confirming identity at the closest possible range. His whole body changed with that breath. The tension sharpened rather than eased. Memory had clicked fully into place. The veteran saw it and understood. This was no general association, no old fear triggered by similar scent. The dog knew this man. Not by face, years had changed that too much, but by the exact layered smell of him beneath rain, beneath coat wool, beneath false age and funeral cologne. Skin chemistry. Metal. Oil. That sterile edge. Battlefield memory carried in the nose of a creature who had never needed words to remember what mattered. The veteran felt his own past sliding open against his will. A blown wall. Fire licking the side of a transport. The handler on one knee in dust, calling the dog back from a blood trail because the team had to extract or die where they stood. The shepherd fighting the command. Looking back again and again toward the fleeing intermediary who vanished behind broken masonry before the second detonation hit. That unfinished pursuit had lived in the dog ever since. And now, at the grave of the only man who truly understood him, the pursuit had ended. A black SUV came hard through the cemetery lane then, tires spitting mud, and two more men stepped out before it had fully stopped. Not responders. Too fast. Too purposeful. One reached inside his coat before his foot even settled on the ground. The veteran saw the motion and moved on pure reflex, shouting a warning just as the old German shepherd lifted his head from the pinned mourner and turned toward the lane with a sound so deep and savage it cut through rain, panic, and ceremony all at once. The funeral had just become an active battlefield again. The first shot did not sound like a cemetery sound. It sounded like memory breaking through the present. Sharp, flat, violent, too familiar against rain and stone and grief. The bullet struck the marble edge of a headstone inches from where one of the uniformed men had crouched, blowing white dust into the wet air and turning controlled evacuation into chaos. People screamed and dropped behind whatever cover they could find. Family members were pulled hard toward the outer access road. The honor detail broke formation completely, some rushing civilians down the slope, others drawing sidearms, with the kind of cold speed that appears only when training outruns thought. The veteran nearest the pinned mortar did not duck so much as shift into an older version of himself, one the war had built and civilian life had never managed to kill. He seized the hidden detonator, shoved it into his own coat pocket to keep it out of reaching hands, and dragged the mortar sideways behind the broadest headstone, while the German shepherd spun toward the cemetery lane in a blur of aged muscle and pure intent. The dog no longer looked old. He looked remembered. The two men by the black SUV moved with the efficiency of professionals who had planned for interruption. One kept low beside the rear door, using the vehicle as partial cover while bringing up a compact weapon fitted with a suppressor. The other advanced 3 steps into the lane and then stopped, scanning not randomly but intelligently, eyes moving between the grave, the family evacuation route, and the cluster of veterans closest to the coffin. This was no panicked extraction team sent to rescue a caught associate. It was a cleanup element. The pinned mortar had been meant to trigger the next phase from inside the funeral, and when the dog exposed him too early, the men outside adapted instantly. That realization landed cold and clear in the veteran's mind even as bullets began punching bark from the trees above the lane. Whoever these men were, they had expected resistance. They had expected witnesses. And they had still come. Rain thickened into a slanting gray curtain that blurred movement at the edges, but not enough to hide muzzle flashes. Somewhere behind the veteran, someone shouted that the family was not clear yet. Somewhere else, a vehicle door slammed, and a child cried out before being silenced by a terrified parent. The entire cemetery had become an exposed trap full of stone markers and soft ground, with civilians still inside the kill zone. The German shepherd saw the advancing gunman before any human voice could direct him. With a bark that felt almost painful in its force, he launched low across the wet grass, not straight for the torso, but at the shooting arm. Years of training and battlefield repetition had shaped the angle of that attack so deeply it remained inside his body even now, after grief, after age, after months of half-starved mourning. The gunman fired once more, missed wide as the dog hit, and both went down hard against a row of flat military markers slick with rain. The weapon skidded into mud. The shepherd clamped onto the forearm above the wrist and drove his weight backward, pinning the man against stone just as he had pinned the mortar, but this time there was no restraint left in him. This was combat. The second man near the SUV pivoted toward the dog immediately, and the veteran rose from behind cover with his sidearm already out, sighting through rain and motion on reflex so old it felt carved into the bones of his hand. He fired once. The round caught the shooter high in the shoulder and spun him half around behind the open vehicle door. Not down. Not finished. Just disrupted. Good enough for a second. Sometimes survival is built one disrupted second at a time. The pinned mortar chose that second to move. He had been playing weaker than he was, conserving himself beneath the dog and the veteran's grip, waiting for distraction. The veteran felt the shift too late. The man drove an elbow backward into his ribs and twisted sharply, almost tearing the hidden device pocket clean from the coat before the veteran smashed him face first into the soaked grass again. They rolled together against a gray border slick with rain and moss. Up close, the mortar smelled exactly as the dog had said he did: metal, sterile compound, cordite ghosted deep into cloth fibers, and beneath it the warm, rotten edge of a man who had spent too many years near violence to ever smell civilian again. "You buried the wrong one," he hissed, and hearing those words while grappling in the mud at a funeral almost emptied the veteran of anger and replaced it with something colder. That phrase meant the dead handler had not merely recognized the past. He had threatened it. He had pushed close enough to truth that the men responsible had decided natural death was safer than exposure. The veteran drove a forearm across the mourner's throat and demanded where the charge was. The man's mouth twisted into a wet, grim smile. "Ask the grave." That answer detonated through the veteran's thoughts more dangerously than any explosive could have. Ask the grave. The coffin. The soil. The ceremonial setup. The funeral itself had been the delivery system all along. He shoved the mourner's face harder into the mud and looked up sharply toward the tarp-covered coffin, now sitting in a strip of open ground that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. No one was near it now. The family had been forced outward, and the honor detail had abandoned the direct approach when the shooting started. But if a charge had been hidden in or beneath the coffin before the service, then distance alone was not enough. It would mean whoever arranged it had access to the process before burial, transport, staging, or the final military honors package. That widened the conspiracy beyond old battlefield vengeance into something more rotten. Someone close enough to funerary procedure had helped. Someone with paperwork, timing, and clearance. The veteran's stomach went cold. He ripped the mourner upright by the collar, pressed the muzzle of the pistol hard against the underside of his jaw, and for the first time let the fury show fully on his face. "Who touched the coffin?" he asked. The man looked at him not with fear, but with the resigned contempt of someone whose mission had already failed and who had nothing left except damage. "Too late," he said softly. A second burst of suppressed fire came from the SUV lane, striking stone and showering chips over the wet grass. The veteran dropped the mourner and turned just in time to see the wounded shooter trying to recover his weapon one-handed from behind the vehicle door, while the German shepherd still tore at the other man's arm on the ground. The dog's movements were slower now, not because he had lost intent, but because age exacts payment even in moments of heroism. His hind legs slipped slightly on the rain-slick grass. His shoulders heaved harder. Yet he did not release. The veteran crossed the open stretch between markers in a low sprint, using rows of stones as staggered cover. Around him, the cemetery had become a surreal collision of the sacred and the tactical, folded flags flapping under rain, overturned flower stands spilling white lilies into mud, polished headstones shattering under rounds meant for the living, mortars in black formal clothes crawling through wet grass, while old soldiers barked evacuation orders in voices dragged out of another life. Somewhere to the left, sirens were finally reaching the gate road. Too far yet. Not enough yet. He fired again at the shooter behind the SUV. This time the round hit the windshield frame, sending fractured glass across the hood and forcing the man lower. Still not enough to stop him. The German shepherd solved that problem in the way only a war dog can. He released the first attacker's arm just long enough to pivot, drive off the soaked ground, and launch at the vehicle door itself as the second shooter leaned out. The impact slammed the metal inward with brutal force, catching the shooter off balance and sending the weapon spinning out under the chassis. The dog hit the ground badly from the rebound, one hind leg folding for half a heartbeat in a way that made the veteran's chest seize with dread, but the old shepherd recovered instantly through sheer will and lunged again, this time into the space between the man and the open door. Teeth found fabric, then flesh. The shooter screamed. Not long. Not dramatically. Just one short involuntary sound of pain and disbelief. The sort of sound men make when they suddenly understand the past has closed its jaws around them. The veteran reached them 2 seconds later, kicked the fallen weapon away, and drove the wounded shooter backward over the seat and into the opposite side of the SUV. Blood mixed with rain on the door frame. The German shepherd held position, snarling now with a depth of threat that warned everyone nearby this target was not to be touched except under his terms. Behind them, the pinned mourner tried once more to rise and flee. He made it 3 stumbling steps through the cemetery row before one of the uniformed veterans tackled him hard across a wet grave border, both of them crashing into flower stands and dark soil. The mourner fought like a man who knew prison was not what waited for him if he was taken alive. He clawed for his inside pocket even though the detonator was already gone. He twisted toward the grave as though drawn by it. He bit, kicked, and almost broke free until 2 more men hit him from opposite sides and buried him under black coats and military weight. Even then, even pinned, he kept his eyes on the coffin. The veteran saw that and knew the answer before any bomb technician could arrive to confirm it. The charge was not in a vehicle, not on one of the mourners, not hidden by the trees. It was attached to the burial itself, probably beneath the coffin frame or in the lowering mechanism where chaos and ritual hid the tampering. That meant one terrible thing more. If the dog had not moved when he did, if he had remained still beside the casket out of grief and obedience, then the ceremony would have reached the final prayer, the family would have stepped closer, old unit members would have gathered tighter, and one signal from the mourner's hidden device would have turned the grave into a slaughter pit. A shiver passed through the veteran so hard it felt like cold entering bone. He looked toward the tarp-covered coffin and, for one impossible moment, saw not the object itself but the dead handler as he had been years ago, crouched in dust, one hand on the shepherd's collar, face set in that same hard concentration he wore whenever instinct was trying to tell him something command preferred not to hear. The dead man had trusted the dog then. Trusted him enough to write down the suspicion nobody else wanted. Trusted him enough to keep asking questions long after other survivors gave up. And now, even from the grave, it was the dog who had finished what the handler started. That truth landed with such force that it nearly unmade the veteran. There was grief in it, yes, but also rage, vindication, and something like shame that the human beings involved had needed years of paperwork, memory, and death to reach what the dog had known in one breath. Some debts never expire. Some loyalties refuse to obey the calendar. In the middle of gunfire and rain and panic, the old shepherd had not only recognized an enemy. He had protected the dead. The first county response vehicles reached the outer cemetery lane then, lights strobing blue and red across wet stone and black uniforms. But even as armed officers spilled out and moved to secure the scene, the veteran's mind was already racing ahead. Capture was no longer enough. Not if the coffin was wired. Not if funeral access had been compromised. Not if the dead handler's natural death had just been followed by an assassination attempt at his service. The conspiracy was not one fugitive from an old war showing up to settle ghosts. It was networked, resourced, and still functioning. Someone had tracked the funeral date. Someone had prepared the device. Someone had cleaned records years ago, and maybe cleaned them again recently. Which meant the dead man's final months mattered more now than they ever had in life. What had he found? Who had he contacted? Why had he gone quiet? And who inside the system had made that silence permanent? The old German shepherd, standing soaked and shaking beside the black SUV with blood on his muzzle and rain on his graying coat, turned his head then, not toward the captured men, not toward the arriving officers, but back toward the coffin again, ears lifting with a different kind of urgency now, as if the danger at the grave had not yet ended. The shift in the dog's posture was small enough that most people would have missed it. After everything that had just happened, the gunfire, the screaming, the mud, the bodies on the ground, the responders rushing in with weapons drawn, any ordinary eye would have read the old shepherd's movement as fatigue. But the veteran had watched this animal for too many years in too many places where one wrong assumption ended in smoke and blood. He knew the difference between a dog coming down from combat and a dog redirecting to unfinished threat. The German shepherd was not looking at the coffin the way a grieving animal looks at the last object connected to a dead handler. He was looking at it the way he had once looked at doors, culverts, alley corners, and abandoned vehicles and places where buried explosives turned routines into funerals. His body was shaking, yes, but not from fear, and not only from age. It was the violent tremor of restraint layered over urgency. Rain darkened his coat until the tan and black blurred together, but the eyes were clear, fixed, terribly alive. The veteran followed the gaze and felt his pulse go hard in his throat. The tarp over the coffin moved once in the wind and then settled. Nothing else. No visible wire. No blinking light. No obvious disturbance. But the dog's attention never broke. Somewhere inside the old animal's war-trained body, the pattern had already been recognized. County officers began shouting for everyone to get farther back, and bomb response was finally on the access road. But finally was a useless word when a cemetery was already lived with possibility. 2 deputies tried to advance toward the grave with caution tape and sidearms, as if distance and procedure could settle a thing like this, but the veteran cut across them before they got close. He did not waste time explaining the dog's full history. There was no time for that. He just said the one sentence that made professionals stop and listen. "If he's looking there, nobody touches it until Edie confirms." The authority in his voice came from the kind of experience no one in that rain wanted to challenge. One of the bomb techs, still pulling on outer gear while jogging through wet grass, glanced from the veteran to the shepherd and understood immediately that this was not superstition. This was field detection from an animal with a record written in blood and service years. The tech signaled the others wider, rerouted the nearest officers, and called for a remote visual before any hands approached. Even then, every second felt criminally slow. The captured mourner was still thrashing in the mud behind 3 men. The wounded shooter by the SUV had finally been zip-tied and dragged clear. The second attacker groaned face down in the rain with a torn arm and a shattered plan. Yet despite all that visible success, the veteran could not shake the certainty that they were still one bad decision from mass death. The German shepherd moved before anyone else did. Not toward the coffin directly, but in a slow, deliberate arc to the right, forcing the veteran to notice something he had missed in the chaos. The dog was not keying on the casket lid itself. He was keying low, near the base, where the lowering straps disappeared into the wet earth, and the mechanical stand sat partially covered by floral displays and ceremonial drapery. That mattered. A device inside the coffin would have pulled the dog higher. This was lower. Ground-based. Structural. Hidden where ritual would keep eyes respectfully away. The veteran cursed under his breath, not because of panic now, but because the design made ugly sense. Funeral mechanics are handled quickly, quietly, and by a small trusted circle. No one stares too long at the equipment around a coffin. No one questions a neatly draped stand beneath a flag. If the blast had come from below, shaped upward, it would have taken the closest mourners, the coffin, the grave detail, and anyone rushing in after. A massacre disguised as symbolic vengeance. The dead handler buried by his own service. The family erased beside him. The surviving team members finished together. And all of it wrapped in public grief, so that the world would call it tragedy before it called it murder. The bomb tech nearest the perimeter went prone behind a stone border and extended a pole-mounted camera first, working angle by angle through rain and blowing tarp corners. Everyone in the immediate ring held still. Even the wind seemed to lower itself. The veteran could hear the old shepherd's breathing now, harder than before, chest drawing and releasing with painful effort, but still anchored to purpose. He crouched beside the dog and placed one hand lightly at the base of the neck, not to restrain, just to tell him the message had been received. The shepherd did not look at him. He kept his eyes locked on the grave setup and gave one low sound deep in his chest, almost a vibration more than a growl. Then the camera feed operator swore under his breath. On the small monitor, half obscured by wet ribbon and funeral greenery. A dark rectangular housing had been fixed beneath the right lowering support where no grieving relative would ever think to look. Wires ran inward, tucked with obscene neatness along the underside frame. The housing itself was sealed against weather. Military grade? Maybe. Custom? Likely. But whatever its origin, it was real. The veteran felt the space behind his ribs go cold and hollow. They had all been standing on top of it. The captured mourner heard the change in surrounding voices and laughed into the mud again, a wet broken sound with no joy in it. "He should have stayed buried," he said, meeting the handler. Maybe the dog, maybe the truth itself. One of the older veterans pinning him nearly lost control then, and had to be dragged back by another pair of hands. The veteran at the dog's side understood that impulse more than he wanted to. But killing this man here, no matter how earned it felt, would only feed the design. Dead saboteurs are cleaner than talking ones. Useful files vanish easier when the last carrier of secrets dies under righteous outrage. The real war had shifted now. The cemetery attack was not the end of revenge. It was the exposed edge of something larger. The dead handler had gotten close enough in his final months that multiple people had been activated to stop him. That required access, planning, and confidence that official explanation would again do most of the work after blood dried. Which meant there were names above these men. Names in offices, archives, procurement logs, burial authorization chains, maybe even in the old deployment files that had already been trimmed to silence years ago. The veteran looked toward the coffin and suddenly hated how neatly everything fit. Official, heart failure, public honor, highly visible funeral, all surviving loose ends gathered in one place. It was not only an attack. It was cleanup disguised as closure. Bomb response moved with maddening care, and in a sane world that would have been reassuring. But the veteran's mind would not stay in the present without dragging the past behind it. He remembered the original ambush in flashes, so vivid the rain around him almost smelled like hot dust instead. Their team had been rerouted late, told the road ahead was safer than the one already briefed. The handler had objected. Quietly, then more firmly. The dog had reacted to a local fixer during the route handoff, same metallic trace, same tension in the body, same refusal to settle. Command had called it overstimulation. They moved anyway. The first explosion hit the lead vehicle from below, shaped charge tearing upward through armored plating, as if the road itself had opened its teeth. The second came from the right berm. The third never detonated because the dead handler, wounded and half-deaf, had dragged the shepherd by the harness toward a ditch, and the dog had found the triggerman before he could complete the chain. But not the facilitator. Never the facilitator. That man vanished into dust, civilians, and corrupted report language. Later, in Med Bay, and then in stateside debriefs, the handler had repeated one thing over and over. "The dog knew him before I did." No one wrote that line into the official record. But the men who loved him remembered it. And now, kneeling in the rain beside that same graying shepherd at the edge of a live funeral grave, the veteran knew the line had been true all along. The old dog swayed once, just enough to show how close he was to the edge of collapse. The veteran slid an arm under the chest instinctively, steadying without forcing him down. Warm blood mixed with rain along the dog's muzzle and lower jaw, not all of it his own. The old shoulders trembled. The breath hitched. Yet even with exhaustion dragging at every part of him, the shepherd kept his nose angled toward the grave hardware, and his ears tuned to every sound in the cemetery. That devotion struck the veteran harder than the device itself. Men had retired. Files had been buried. Commanders had transferred, died, or disappeared into pensions. But this animal, who owed civilization nothing and had already given more than most people ever could, had held the scent line of a betrayal for years without language, without closure, without promises. He had brought it all the way here to the grave of the one man who trusted him enough to listen. The veteran bowed his head for just 1 second against the wet fur at the neck and felt grief arrive in full, not as weakness, but as proof of how much had been carried. "You were right," he whispered, and whether he meant the dog or the dead handler no longer mattered. Both had been right. The living had simply taken too long to catch up. The first technical assessment came back with bad news hidden inside good. The device was real, armed, and linked to the recovered trigger in a probable short-range signal chain. That meant the mortar had indeed been the intended activator. But the bigger problem was tamper contingency. The housing showed signs of anti-disturbance design. Pressure shift, tilt switch, maybe both. The bomb tech relaying the findings kept his voice calm. But calm in these moments is only a uniform for dread. They could not simply rush in and snip visible wires. They needed a controlled disruption or robotic approach, and the robot unit was not here yet. The grave had to remain isolated. The coffin had to remain untouched. The family had to be kept at distance without anyone letting the panic fully escape into media and public feed before they knew whether the broader area was clean. Every added complication made one thing more obvious. This operation had not been built by some drifter with old hate and a homemade fantasy of revenge. It had been built by people who understood explosives, ceremony timing, access control, and how institutional hesitation can become their greatest weapon. The veteran turned and looked at the captured mourner. The man met his eyes, and, despite the mud on his face and the knee in his spine, managed to look almost satisfied. Not because he was winning. Because even in failure, he had forced the truth into a shape that would hurt. A deputy came up behind the veteran and asked whether the dead handler had enemies. It was an honest question asked by someone who still thought in singular nouns. The veteran almost answered, "Yes," but stopped himself because that word was too small now. Enemies implied memory and grudge. This was system. This was residue from a war that never ended cleanly because too many people had profited from its confusion, and too many lies had been filed as final. The handler had not died just because one old adversary hated him. He had died because he kept pulling at a thread others needed buried. The funeral attack proved it. The captured mourner and his shooters were not the last layer. They were the layer disposable enough to send into weather and public risk. Somewhere higher sat the one who authorized the burial access, the forged clearance, the timing, maybe even the medical silence around the dead man's last months. The veteran understood then that the cemetery was no longer only a crime scene. It was an opening. A place where the dead had forced the living to look in the right direction. He looked again toward the old shepherd, who at last lowered himself slowly to the wet grass, but refused to take his eyes off the grave. Even lying down, he remained on duty. Then one of the bomb techs raised a hand sharply for quiet. Everyone near us froze. Through the rain, faint but distinct, a second electronic ping came from somewhere beyond the grave. Not from the visible device. Not from the recovered trigger. Another signal source. Another layer. The veteran's head snapped toward the sound at the exact same instant the German shepherd did, and both of them locked on the same direction, the row of vehicles parked behind the chapel trees, where one black funeral sedan still sat untouched beneath dripping branches. The old dog tried to rise despite exhaustion, and the veteran knew with sick certainty that the grave had never been the only bomb. The realization hit so hard it seemed to strip the rain of sound for a second. The grave had been the spectacle, the obvious kill zone, the place meant to seize every eye and every instinct once the funeral broke apart. But if there was another signal source in the parked vehicle row, then the attack had never depended on one successful detonation. It had been layered, built with the kind of patience that belongs to men who understand how professionals react under pressure. One device to draw response, another to punish the response. One threat to freeze the family, another to finish the survivors when they tried to move them. The veteran did not wait for bomb tech confirmation, because the German Shepherd had already made the decision for him. The old dog pushed up from the wet grass with visible pain, hindquarters slow for one terrible moment before shear will force the body upright, and then he turned fully toward the chapel trees, where the black funeral sedan sat half hidden beneath dripping branches. His ears locked forward. His nostrils widened once. That was enough. The veteran shouted for everyone to clear the vehicle line immediately, and this time nobody questioned him. The first device under the grave had ended argument. Men moved fast now, grabbing mourners by elbows and shoulders, dragging them farther up the access road, away from every parked car, every van, every polished hearse that until minutes ago had been part of ceremony instead of target geometry. The black sedan had belonged, officially, to the contracted funeral transport service that handled family overflow and ceremonial escorts. It had arrived early, parked where instructed, and remained so unremarkable that no one gave it a second glance after the first disruption. That was the genius of men who build death into routine. They never ask the world to hide them in dramatic places. They hide in expected ones. The sedan sat angled beneath bare branches with rain slicking its windows and hood, looking as ordinary as grief itself. No visible tampering. No open doors. No broken glass. Yet the old shepherd stared at it, with the same hard certainty he had given the grave and the mourner. The veteran moved low across the soaked grass, using stone rows and parked support vehicles for staggered cover, while 2 deputies and 1 bomb tech followed at wider distance. Behind him, the captured mourners suddenly began thrashing again with fresh intensity, shouting something in a language the younger officers did not understand, but the veteran did well enough to catch one word through the rain. Burn. The kind of word men use when they know timing matters and fire is part of the plan. That single word turned the veteran's suspicion from bad to worse. A second device in a vehicle could mean fragmentation, yes, but it could also mean fuel ignition, secondary spread, mass casualty by fire in a cemetery packed with dry ceremonial cloth, vehicles, and panicked people running with no clear direction. Even failure could become spectacle. The German Shepherd reached the sedan first, but unlike before, he did not strike. He circled once, nose low, tracing the perimeter with brutal concentration. The veteran saw the pattern instantly, and understood this too was information. The scent source was not centered in the cabin. It was strongest toward the rear undercarriage and trunk line, perhaps near the wheel well or fuel compartment where heat, pressure, and concealment worked together. The dog stopped at the left rear quarter panel and gave a short explosive bark, then another, then backed half a step as if the location itself was intolerable. He had done that only a handful of times overseas, each time around vehicles where explosives had been hidden in ways too tight for direct contact. The veteran dropped behind a neighboring stone cross and raised the hand signal to freeze everyone. The bomb tech with the field monitor crawled up beside him, rain running down the clear face shield while the remote scanner unit swept in short arcs toward the sedan. Seconds stretched so long they felt manufactured. Then the monitor chirped. Not one signal. 3. 1 in the trunk cavity. 1 forward under the driver's side dash. 1 near the rear axle. Linked or redundant, impossible to say yet, but the pattern was obvious enough. If the funeral device failed or was interrupted, anyone loading family members into transport, using vehicles for cover, or evacuating through the lane would trigger the second trap. The veteran closed his eyes for 1 second, because the dead handler's family had nearly been driven straight into it while fleeing the shooting. No one spoke above a whisper now. Even the officers who had arrived late and still smelled of cruiser interiors instead of rain and earth understood that the cemetery had become a design labyrinth of delayed death. The bomb tech muttered that the sedan was wired professionally, with a likely anti-handling circuit paired to remote backup. The veteran asked the only question that mattered in that second. "Can it be driven remotely?" The tech looked at him through the shield, eyes hardening. "If there's a dead man contingency buried in that build, maybe." Which meant this was not merely a planted bomb in a parked car. It might have been intended to move, to redirect, to ram, to follow confusion toward the road if someone tried a standard perimeter hold. The veteran's gaze shifted immediately to the cemetery gate where ambulances and county vehicles were now stacked in partial disarray, creating the kind of choke point an attacker loves because fear builds traffic faster than traffic can escape fear. He turned back toward the captured mourner. The man had gone still again. Too still. Watching. Listening. Waiting to see whether they were smart enough to survive what came after exposure. The veteran knew that stillness. Men who build layered traps do not hope for one success. They wait to study what kind of mind is hunting them in return. Rain collected along the German shepherd's back and dripped from his graying muzzle as he held position near the sedan, body taut despite visible exhaustion. The veteran called him back softly once. The dog did not obey. Not disobedience born of distress. Refusal born of mission. That struck the veteran with almost physical force because it brought back another memory of the dead handler, years earlier, standing in desert heat beside a disabled truck while the same dog refused recall until a second pressure plate was found beneath what everyone thought was the safe side of the vehicle. Afterward, the handler had laughed once, rough and tired, and told the team the dog trusted his nose more than any human briefing, which was wise because his nose had never once been promoted into paperwork. That same wariness lived in the old shepherd now. Even after injury, after grief, after months of fading life, he was still reading the hidden geometry of violence better than the people around him. The veteran rose into a crouch and moved 3 steps closer, not to pull the dog away by force, but to put his own body where the animal could see he had understood. "I know," he said under his breath, and the shepherd flicked one ear without looking back. That tiny movement was enough. Acknowledged. "Keep working." From the chapel side came a fresh burst of shouting. One of the funeral service employees had tried to slip past the outer perimeter and was now being dragged down hard beside a catering van by 2 county officers. At first glance, he looked exactly what he had presented all morning: middle-aged, thinning hair, damp black overcoat, the soft rushed apology of a man caught in the wrong place during a crisis. But the veteran had lost patience for first glances. He left the sedan to the tech team and crossed back through rain and churned grass as fast as his age and old injuries allowed. By the time he reached the scuffle, the employee's right sleeve had torn at the seam. Beneath the black cloth was not the pale arm of a service worker trembling from shock, but another chemical-banded burn circling the wrist in a pattern too familiar now to be coincidence. The man saw the veteran notice it, and whatever mask of civilian panic he had been wearing vanished. His face emptied into calculation. "You should have let the dog die with him," he said quietly, and in that sentence lay the whole rotten heart of it. These men had not underestimated the surviving soldiers. They had underestimated the dog. They assumed age, grief, and retirement had turned him into symbol. They forgot that memory carried in a war dog is not sentimental. It is practical, sensory, exact. It waits. The officers hauled the fake employee upright and found, hidden inside the lining of his overcoat, a second signal relay, smaller than the first, paired to a disposable phone sealed in weather wrap. That meant the black sedan was not only armed but actively supervised. Someone had stayed close enough to adjust timing if the funeral shifted. Someone had arranged positions inside the service perimeter itself. The veteran's thoughts snapped immediately toward the last months before the handler's death. The dead man had not only been digging into old files. He had started asking questions about a funeral benefits subcontractor recently awarded military ceremony transport in the region. The veteran remembered dismissing that at the time as grief-driven obsession because it sounded too far removed from battlefield betrayal to matter. He could still hear himself telling the handler to let the bureaucracy handle the bureaucracy. That memory tasted bitter now, because the handler had been right again. If access to the coffin, the grave hardware, and the parked sedan had all been manipulated, then the line from the old ambush to the present ran not just through former insurgent facilitators, but through modern civilian contracts, false service credentials, and the easy invisibility of ceremonial logistics. War had changed clothes. That was all. It no longer needed an alley and a trigger wire in desert dust. It could wear a black overcoat, carry a clipboard, and walk among mourners with polished shoes. The county commander finally reached the center of the scene and started doing what good commanders do when handed a nightmare. They stopped caring how impossible it sounded and began building order around the people who had been right first. Perimeter widened again. Vehicle row fully evacuated. All funeral staff detained pending verification. Family moved to a hardened shelter point near the gate road. Bomb response split into two teams, one for the grave device and one for the sedan. A state investigative unit was requested, then federal, because at some point a county cemetery attack linked to a wartime sabotage network grows beyond local jurisdiction and becomes something no official report can politely mislabel. Through it all, the veteran remained inside the hot zone in practice if not in declared role, because no one else on that field understood the old Centrail, the dead handler's history, and the German Shepherd's signals as one connected language. The dog himself had finally allowed the veteran to guide him a few yards back from the sedan, but only after a final circle confirmed the threat pattern. When he sat at last, he did not collapse. He sat as he had sat by the coffin, upright, deliberate, still on duty. Blood had begun drying dark under rainwater along his muzzle. One shoulder quivered. Breath came harder now, deeper, with a faint catch at the end. Yet the eyes never softened. Not while danger remained named but unfinished. The veteran knelt beside him and, for the first time since the shooting began, let his hand rest fully against the old dog's neck. The warmth there, the living solidity, struck him with sudden painful tenderness. This animal should have been allowed to grow old in peace beside the man who loved him. Instead he was here, in cold rain among bombs and graves, finishing a war the humans had filed away long before it was over. The veteran felt anger rise again, but beneath it was something heavier and more dangerous: guilt. Because the handler had tried to tell them. He had called, written, pushed, asked questions no one wanted asked. He had said the ambush was not finished history. He had said the dog still reacted to traces that no paper trail explained. He had said if anything happened to him, they should not trust the neat version. And now here they all were, standing in a cemetery full of proof so ugly it made the original battlefield look almost honest. The veteran bent close to the shepherd's ear, and said what should have been said much earlier. "I should have listened sooner." The dog turned his head then, just enough for one rain-dark eye to meet his. No judgment lived there. No bitterness. Only the terrible calm of a creature that had never stopped doing the work. A sharp crack split the air from the cemetery gate road. Not gunfire this time, but something mechanical failing under forced ignition. Every head turned. At the far end of the lane, one of the support vans jerked violently against the curb, engine screaming alive even though no driver was visible behind the wheel. For one frozen second it sat there shuddering in the rain, nose pointed directly toward the shelter point where the dead handler's family had just been moved. Then the van surged forward on its own, tires throwing muddy water across the gate stones, and the veteran knew with sick clarity that the black sedan and the grave had only been phases 1 and 2. The real architects of this ambush had built a third strike into the evacuation itself. The van came alive with the obscene violence of a machine obeying a dead hand. Its headlights flared through the rain, white and blinding across wet stone and black coats, and the engine howled as if someone had pinned the accelerator to the floor. There was no driver in the seat. No visible struggle at the wheel. Just an empty vehicle surging toward the shelter point where the dead handler's family had been moved, where his widow stood under emergency cover with 2 sons, and the last people he had trusted enough to call brothers. For half a heartbeat, everyone watching was caught between disbelief and motion. Then training returned faster than fear. Officers shouted for the family to scatter. One deputy fired at the windshield out of reflex, the round spidering glass, but doing nothing to alter the van's path. Another tried to sprint into the lane and drag the nearest civilians clear, but the veteran knew that was not fast enough. The distance was wrong. The angle was wrong. The weight and speed of the vehicle made heroism on foot a losing calculation. And beside him, the old German shepherd was already moving. The dog did not charge the front of the van the way an unthinking animal might. He cut diagonally across the soaked cemetery grass toward the narrow point where the lane bit between 2 stone columns before opening toward the shelter point. It was the same tactical intelligence he had shown all morning, the same war-bred understanding that a threat is not always best met at its strongest face. The veteran ran after him without deciding to, boots tearing through mud, lungs burning, sidearm raised, though he knew bullets alone would not stop what was coming if explosives had been worked into the vehicle frame. Rain slashed into his eyes. Voices merged into a single frantic roar behind him. The German shepherd reached the bend first and turned in one sharp, disciplined pivot to face the oncoming van, not with suicidal chaos, but with the precise body language of a dog identifying the exact moment a machine becomes vulnerable. The veteran saw it too, almost at the same time. The steering angle was locked too rigidly. The front right wheel kept twitching under force correction. Something about the control system was improvised. Remote guidance maybe? Mechanical override maybe. Not stable. Not built for terrain like this. If the van lost traction even once, it would miss the shelter line and plow through the old stone boundary instead. If the German shepherd lunged not at the body of the van, but toward a hanging line beneath the front quarter panel, something loose, dark, almost invisible in the rain, slapping against the axle as the vehicle hit the bend too hard. A cable. A tether. Maybe part of the external trigger assembly. Maybe a quick rig added in haste once the funeral collapsed into open conflict. The dog's teeth found it in a blur of mud and flying water. The van jerked instantly, not stopping, but yawing half a foot left as the front suspension dipped hard. The cable snapped free under the combined force of speed and the dog's weight, and the machine swerved violently across the lane toward the boundary stones. The veteran screamed the dog's name even though the sound was lost in engine noise and rain, and for one horrible instant he thought the shepherd had gone under the tires. But the old animal twisted clear at the last possible second, shoulders slamming into mud as the van clipped the stone column, bounced, then plowed broadside into the cemetery wall in an eruption of shattered masonry, torn metal, and white steam. The impact was not the blast they feared. It was almost worse in its uncertainty, because when a rigged vehicle stops without detonating, every second after becomes a held breath waiting to learn whether survival was real or only delayed. The family hit the ground under a wave of shouted commands. Officers piled behind concrete barriers and stone monuments. Bomb response dropped flat where they were, hands over heads by pure reflex despite all their training. The veteran reached the German shepherd first, sliding to his knees in mud beside the old dog's body, just as the van's engine coughed, sputtered, and kept running. That was bad. Running meant active systems. Running meant power still feeding whatever circuit lay hidden under the wrecked frame. The dog was breathing, thank God, but harshly now, one hind leg tucked wrong for a second before pain and instinct forced it straight again. There was blood on the shoulder, more than before, mixing with rainwater and mud. The veteran's hand found the chest, then the neck, confirming what mattered most, alive. The shepherd tried to rise immediately, not because the pain was absent, but because the mission wasn't finished. That nearly broke something inside the veteran. Even now, even after the grave, the shooters, the second device, the sprint through the rain, the dog still believed his work was incomplete. He was right. The van hissed and clicked against the stone wall like a thing thinking. The bomb team leader crawled forward behind a low memorial slab and shouted for everyone to stay down. Through the fractured windshield and caved hood, no flames were visible yet. Good. Through the rear side panel, however, there was intermittent strobing from inside the cargo cavity. Not full detonation sequence maybe, but definitely active electronics. One of the state troopers, who had just arrived on scene, shouted that the remote frequency was still alive. Another answered that signal was bouncing, maybe from a nearby handset, maybe from an automated loop trigger. The veteran's mind jumped immediately back to the captured funeral employee and the relay hidden in his coat. Not enough. There had to be one more operator, or one more program stage. They had built this too carefully to trust only human timing. The old caretaker from the bunker in another life might have called that layered denial. In plain language, it meant if one hand failed, another circuit continued the kill. The veteran turned his head toward the pinned mourner, and the fake serviceman now held under armed guard near the outer lane. Both were on the ground. Both were alive. And yet neither looked surprised that the van had moved. That told him the command had not come from either of them in real time. Which meant somewhere nearby, someone else was still watching the funeral. The rain shifted with the wind and brought the scent to the German shepherd before it brought it to any man. The dog's head lifted sharply from the mud. Not toward the van. Not toward the captured men. Toward the chapel itself, where the rear portico stood half obscured by rain curtains and black ceremonial bunting. The veteran followed the movement and saw, in the dark recess behind the chapel doors, a figure stepping backward into shadow with something rectangular in hand. Tablet. Trigger board. Remote monitor. It happened so fast that another man might have doubted what he saw, but the old shepherd had already confirmed it with a low tearing bark that rolled out of him like pain turned into warning. The veteran came up firing 2 fast rounds into the portico stone, forcing the figure deeper back and shattering a side lantern in a burst of glass and dead light. The chapel doors slammed inward. Locked or barred immediately. Inside, somewhere beyond wood and rain and distance, a new electronic chirp answered from the crashed van. Then another. The machine had been handed off. This was not cleanup anymore. This was command and control from inside sacred space. The war had walked itself right up the church steps. Every instinct told the veteran to rush the portico, but the bomb team leader shouted him down with a truth too brutal to ignore. If the chapel operator still had the van alive and the grave device linked, then any frontal assault without interruption control could trigger both. They needed to jam or sever signal pathways before breaching. They needed seconds they did not have. The old shepherd solved that problem the only way left. He pushed himself to all fours despite the wound and staggered toward the crashed van, nose low, reading its underside through steam, rain, and leaking coolant. The veteran moved with him, ready to pull him clear if the machine so much as clicked wrong. But the dog was searching, not fleeing. Then he found it. A slim receiver assembly tucked behind the damaged right front wheel well, exposed now by the impact with the wall. Wiring ran from it toward the engine compartment and back under the floor pan. The receiver had not been meant to survive a crash. It had. Barely. One more signal, one more clean impulse, and the whole thing could still go up. The bomb tech saw it too and started shouting instructions for a disruptor shot, but the angle was bad, the line obstructed by twisted metal and stone. The veteran understood in one glance that they might not get the perfect shot in time. He also understood what the dog's body had already chosen to do. The old shepherd crouched low again, eyes locked on that exposed receiver with the same terrible certainty he had shown every other hidden threat. He was going to go for it. "No," the veteran said, not loudly, but with the full weight of a plea breaking through command. The German shepherd flicked one ear back toward him, and that small motion nearly undid him, because it was the same acknowledgment the dog had given his dead handler on roads and rooftops and shattered compounds when both of them knew a command had been heard, respected, and overruled by necessity. The dog launched. Not cleanly. Not with youth. But with experience. He hit the wheel well hard enough to tear the half-exposed assembly free from its mount, just as the chapel doors opened again and another signal pulse flashed through the rain. The receiver sparked in the dog's jaws. The van's electronics screamed once in a high dying whine. Then the entire system went dark. Engine cut. Interior strobe dead. Trigger chain broken. Silence slammed down so suddenly it felt unreal. For half a beat no one on the field moved, because everyone needed the next second to happen before believing the current one. It did. No blast came. No fireball. No upward bloom of steel and blood. Only rain on broken stone, steam from the van's ruined hood, and the old dog stumbling backward with the destroyed receiver clamped between his teeth like one last captured enemy. The figure in the chapel made the mistake of running then. Maybe the silence unnerved him. Maybe seeing the system die in the jaws of the very dog he had counted out snapped whatever discipline he had left. He burst from the side door into the rain, not toward the road, but toward the cemetery's rear service path where fewer officers had yet repositioned. Tall, formal black coat, gray at the temples, posture too upright for panic. Not a gunman. Not a hired mourner. Something worse. Someone accustomed to command. The veteran saw the face only in fragments as the man cut through rain and headstones. But even fragments were enough to tear old memory wide open. He had seen that face once before in a briefing 10 years ago, dry and clean and high above the dust where patrol routes were approved. Not a field man. An advisor. Contract liaison. Security consultant. One of the polished civilians who moved between agencies, contractors, and intelligence notes, with access nobody ever fully explained. That same man had visited the unit's forward base 2 days before the ambush, smiling too easily, asking too casually about route shifts and local assets. After the ambush, he disappeared from all visible paperwork. The veteran had not thought about his face in years, because there had been no proof it mattered. But the dog had proof now. The dog had pulled the chain all the way out of the grave. The German shepherd dropped the ruined receiver and turned toward the fleeing man, with a sound so low it barely resembled a bark anymore. It was older than that. Deeper. A final answer carried through rain. The veteran rose and ran after the figure between wet stones and collapsing ceremony, knowing with dreadful certainty that the funeral had stopped being an ambush site and become something far more dangerous, a live corridor back to the one man who had orchestrated the original betrayal, the handler's death, and the attempt to bury all remaining witnesses in a single morning. And as the fleeing figure vaulted the rear cemetery fence and vanished into the storm-dark trees, the veteran understood the worst part of all. The dog did not hesitate for even one breath before following, which meant this scent, above all others, was the one he had been carrying for years. The real enemy had finally stepped into the open. The fence tore at his coat as he vaulted it, and the cold rain hit harder beneath the trees where the cemetery lights no longer reached. Ahead of him, the old German shepherd moved through the storm-dark woods like a memory that had finally been given permission to finish itself. No hesitation left, no confusion, no age except what pain could no longer hide in the uneven drive of one hind leg. The fleeing man had chosen the rear tree line because he knew what most people knew about cemeteries in weather like this, that panic, darkness, and uneven ground break pursuit faster than bullets do. But he had forgotten the one thing that had undone every layer of his plan all morning. He was not being hunted by people alone. He was being followed by the same living record he had failed to erase years ago, a war dog whose memory existed in scent, adrenaline, blood, dust, and betrayal, and whose loyalty had carried the unfinished shape of that betrayal all the way from a battlefield to a funeral grave. The veteran ran after them with his lungs burning and rain needling his face, branches snapping against his shoulders, boots sliding through mud and wet pine needles, each breath dragging grief and fury through the same chest. Somewhere behind him, officers and responding units were shouting coordinates into radios, but the forest swallowed those voices almost immediately. Out here it was simpler. Hunter. Witness. Quarry. The trees opened briefly onto an old drainage channel choked with brush and runoff, and there, in the pale spill of a distant security light from the cemetery road, he saw the figure ahead stumble for the first time. Not from fear. From age, weight, and the awful realization that the dog was gaining. The German shepherd closed the distance in a burst that should not have been possible after everything already demanded of him that day. His body looked worn, yes, but what can make a wrecked frame terrifying for a few final seconds, and that is what the veteran saw now. The old dog launched low and hard into the backs of the man's knees just as the fugitive reached the far edge of the channel, and both went down into mud and winter runoff with a violent splash. The man rolled fast, trained enough even now to protect his throat, and reached for a hidden weapon inside the breast of his coat, but the shepherd had learned long ago that hands kill before mouths do. He clamped down on the forearm instead and drove the body into the bank, growling with a savage depth that felt less like anger than judgment. The veteran arrived seconds later and hit the man from the side before the hand could clear the coat. They crashed together into wet brush, the smell of mud, blood, rain, and old chemical residue rising around them like the stink of the past itself. The weapon that came loose was small, polished, and intimate in its design, not a battlefield rifle or crude pistol, but the kind of close weapon chosen by men who work around civilians and still expect to kill cleanly when needed. It spun into the runoff and vanished beneath leaves. The fugitive struck once with the free hand, catching the veteran across the cheekbone, but there was no strength left in his advantage now. Not against a surviving soldier fueled by years of delayed grief. Not against a dog that had waited too long to let him go. The veteran drove him face first into the mud, forced both arms behind his back, and pressed him there while the shepherd, trembling with pain and rain and exertion, kept his teeth locked above the wrist exactly where command control once taught him to hold a man alive until the team arrived. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The fugitive only breathed in broken, furious bursts, cheek buried in black mud, expensive mourning clothes ruined, the polished shape of authority finally reduced to what it had always been beneath paperwork and distance. A coward who built safety for himself out of other men's graves. The veteran's own breath came ragged, each inhale dragging the cold deeper into his lungs. But even through exhaustion, he could feel the moment shifting. This was no longer a chase. This was testimony. The man beneath him was the bridge between the original ambush, the dead handlers, natural, death, the detonators at the funeral, the infiltrators and borrowed funeral rolls, the burial access, the layered kill plans, the years of lies. 100 questions crowded forward at once, all of them sharp enough to cut. Why the ambush? Who sold the route? Who buried the report? Who signed the contracts? who ordered the handler silence when he kept digging. But in the end, only one question came out first, maybe because it was the oldest. "Why him?" The fugitive laughed into the mud, and the sound of it, small and bitter, and soaked by rain, enraged the veteran more than any denial would have. "Because he wouldn't stop," the man said. "Most of you took the pension, the medals, the nightmares, and learned to call silence peace." He kept asking. The veteran felt his grip tighten involuntarily. The answer landed like iron because it was so simple, so bureaucratically evil in its simplicity. The handler had not been killed because he was dangerous in some dramatic public way. He had been killed because he remained inconvenient, because he refused to file his pain as history, because he listened to the dog when the institutions told him not to, because some men survive war only to discover the real enemy was waiting inside the neat machinery that cleans it up. The fugitive kept talking once he realized capture had already happened and that the bombs, the grave, the shooters, all of it had failed. Maybe men like him need confession once the architecture of control collapses. Maybe he mistook explanation for power. Or maybe the dog's teeth on his arm and the veteran's hand at the back of his neck had dragged him down to the level where truth smells like wet soil and blood instead of polished office air. He said the route change years ago had not been about ideology alone. There had been money and instability, contracts and escalation, quiet transfer lines that needed one patrol in the wrong place at the right time so future budgets and private arrangements remained alive. The ambush facilitator on the ground had been local, expendable, chemically obsessive, easy for the dog to remember because he assembled his own triggers with sterilizing compounds that clung to skin. But the real protection came from above, from men who wore civilian titles and crossed government thresholds without being remembered. The fugitive had been one of them. A liaison then, a consultant later, a ghost inside systems that relied on respectable language to disguise predation. After the ambush, when the handler would not let the scent trail die, surveillance followed. After retirement, when the handler reopened private inquiries and began tracing ceremonial service contracts, he was warned. When warnings failed, medication records, cardiac history, and one engineered night alone were enough to make his death look natural. The funeral was only meant to erase the rest. Family, survivors, dog, evidence. "The service would have buried everything for us," the man said, and even now there was pride in how tidy he thought that sounded. The veteran wanted to kill him then. The urge was not abstract. It was immediate, physical, honest. Rain running into his eyes. Mud under his knees. The fugitive breathing because the dog had chosen capture over vengeance, and because the veteran had not yet betrayed that choice. It would have been so easy to lean harder, to let anger become weight, to tell himself the man had forfeited every claim to mercy years ago in desert dust, and again at a graveside wrapped in flags. But before the thought could turn into act, the German shepherd shifted and gave one low warning sound, not at the fugitive, but at the veteran. It was astonishing in its clarity. Not this way. The old dog's teeth loosened just enough to remind him of the difference between justice and rage. The dead handler had trusted this animal more than commanders, more than reports, more than the clean lies of men who spoke in official language. In that moment, kneeling in the mud with a murderer pinned beneath his hands, the veteran understood why. The dog had never once confused recognition with revenge. He had found, exposed, protected, and held. Again and again. At the funeral. At the sedan. At the grave. Here in the woods. The animal who could have torn this man apart had instead dragged the truth fully into the open, and demanded that the living be worthy of it. The veteran lowered his head for a second, rain and breath mixing in the space between him and the dog, and when he lifted it again, the killing impulse had not vanished, but it had been mastered. "You don't get to disappear into the ground," he told the fugitive. You answer in daylight." By the time officers reached the drainage cut, the scene looked less like an arrest than the final frame of a war nobody had admitted was still being fought. The fugitive was hauled upright in cuffs, face bloodied, coat ruined, composure finally gone. The veteran stood only when he was sure the man was secure, and when he did, the world tilted hard enough that one deputy had to catch his elbow. He shook him off gently. Pride had nothing to do with it. He just needed his first movement after capture to be his own. The German shepherd, however, could no longer fake strength he had already spent 10 times over. As soon as the fugitive was taken 3 steps away, the old dog tried to follow, then faltered. The wounded shoulder dipped. The hind leg gave just enough to betray the damage. He did not fall dramatically. He simply ran out of force, lowering himself into the wet leaves with that same disciplined dignity he had carried all day, as if even collapse had to happen on his own terms. The veteran dropped beside him instantly, one hand under the chest, the other smoothing rain from the graying fur at the neck. The dog's eyes found his, still alert, still painfully conscious, and in them the veteran saw the whole road of the day behind them, the grave, the bombs, the mourners, the old handler's silence, the forest chase, the man in the mud. Work completed. Witness delivered. Loyalty fulfilled. "You did it," the veteran whispered, voice gone rougher than he knew. "He knows now. They all do." The shepherd's ears twitched once at the sound, and then, finally, some of the terrible tension left his face. The aftermath did not arrive cleanly. It came in layers, like everything else tied to that old ambush. Federal investigators replaced local ones before dawn. Phones were seized. Contracts were frozen. Service companies folded under scrutiny so fast it looked almost graceful, the way rotten structures collapse once one true load is placed against them. The grave device and vehicle rig yielded component traces tied to procurement chains thought long dead. Archived route change orders resurfaced. Names once redacted became suddenly readable when enough frightened men realized the captured fugitive was speaking to save his own skin. The dead handler's medical records were reopened and found to have been altered through a private contractor whose invoices connected back to the same network of logistical consultants that had survived the war by changing titles and uniforms. Reporters eventually got pieces of it, then more than pieces, though the public version would always be flatter than the truth. It would say conspiracy, corruption, buried battlefield scandal, funeral attack disrupted by retired military dog. All of that was true. None of it was enough. Because the deepest truth was simpler and harder to publish. An old soldier had died because he would not stop listening to the warning carried in the instincts of the dog who once saved him, and that same dog had refused to let his handler be buried beneath a lie. In the weeks that followed, the funeral was held again. Not repeated, because nothing so wounded can be repeated cleanly. Held again, under guard, in weather so still it felt like mercy. This time, there were no strangers in the crowd without names attached to them. No unverified vehicles. No hidden service workers. No access point left unsearched. The family came back because the widow said grief had already been stolen once, and she would not surrender it twice. The surviving veterans returned because they understood that fear must never be allowed to write the last line over a soldier's grave. And the German shepherd came too, though slower now, one shoulder permanently altered, muzzle wider than before, body carrying the visible cost of what he had done. When he lay down beside the coffin again, the entire cemetery seemed to exhale. Not because danger was impossible now, but because truth had entered the ground before the coffin did. The veteran stood nearest to the dog once more, but the silence between them had changed. It no longer held unfinished warning. It held understanding. When the final words were spoken and the honor shots cracked through the air, the old shepherd did not rise to hunt. He lifted his head only once toward the trees, testing the wind out of habit, then settled back beside the grave. For the first time in years, there was no hidden set he needed to follow. After the burial, when most of the mourners had gone and the sky was beginning to pale at the edges, the veteran remained behind with the dog and the fresh earth. The cemetery was quiet except for the faint hiss of wind through winter grass and the distant hum of departing engines on the road below. He took off his gloves, crouched beside the old shepherd, and rested both hands along the thick fur at the neck. The dog leaned into him with a weariness that no longer needed to pretend otherwise. He would have hated all the speeches, the veteran said softly toward the grave, and for the first time since the first funeral shattered under gunfire, a broken kind of smile touched his face. But he would have liked this part. He would have liked knowing you got there first. The shepherd closed his eyes for a second at the sound of the dead handler's remembered presence, then opened them again and looked not at the grave, but at the man beside him. Some bonds do not end when one heart stops. They pass. They hand responsibility across silence. In that look, the veteran understood what remained for him now. Not vengeance. Not even exposure. Those had already begun. What remained was stewardship of the truth, of the family left behind, and of the aging dog who had carried memory farther and more faithfully than any living witness. So the ending was not triumph. It was something rarer and more honest. The network that had hidden behind uniforms, contracts, and old war paperwork did not vanish in one night, but it was broken open badly enough that sunlight could finally do what secrecy never could. The dead handler's name was cleared where it had been quietly doubted. The ambush report was amended. The funeral attack became evidence instead of rumor. And the old German shepherd, who should have been allowed only rest, became the reason the dead were no longer buried under official lies. In the months after, he lived not as symbol but as family. He slept beside the veteran's chair, woke from bad dreams less often, and on cold mornings still tested the air before stepping into the yard, because some instincts never leave and do not need to. The veteran did not mind. He no longer mistook vigilance for damage alone. Sometimes it is also devotion. Sometimes it is the final form of love. And when winter returned and the two of them went back once more to the cemetery ridge where the handler lay under clean stone and open sky, there was no ambush waiting, no hidden trigger, no stranger carrying the wrong scent through the mourners. There was only wind, pale sunlight, and the quiet truth that some battlefield debts are not paid in bloodshed, but in remembering exactly who the enemy was, exactly who stayed loyal, and exactly who made it possible for the living to bury the dead with honor at last.